What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Unlock Your Potential. I'm your host, Francesco Bartolillo, and today we have an awesome solo episode for you. Today's episode was actually, sparked by or inspired by a quote that I have heard a couple times, but I recently saw on social media, and it kind of got me, thinking about this idea of habits and the forming of habits and breaking habits and how that impacts your life. And so I'll share the quote with you to start. It's a quote from Aristotle, and it goes, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." And so this really just got me thinking about the idea of that our habits that we have and the things we do on a daily basis ultimately are a reflection of who we are as people and the life we're living. And so if you want to, live a life of excellence, you need to have daily habits that are reflective of that. And so I got, into this thought process of, is that even possible to, dictate your habits? Can you break them? Can you form new ones? And the exciting thing is that the science shows that you can, for the most part, form and break new habits, and you do have control. The tough part is it's not an easy thing to do. So my hope is with today's episode is that I can share some things with you that I think will really help you form and break habits. And so before we get into sharing what I call my 6 science-backed rules or tips for making and breaking habits, I want to first talk a bit about the science behind the forming and breaking of habits itself, what's happening in the brain, that sort of thing. And I also want to share a bit of it was a research study that was conducted that I think really does a good job of giving you more of a visual or an idea of why habits actually can never be forgotten, but they can be broken and they can be replaced. So let's get started. So as I said, to start off the podcast, I want to talk about the science behind, forming habits and breaking habits. But before we even go that far, first let's preface all this by saying the quote that inspired this, which was, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." Excellence, that part of that quote, is going to be subjective in some ways. Yes, there are, measurables for dictating if somebody is in a category of excellence in a certain area of their life. But in general, what one person deems as excellence in sport might be different from another person. The same way what another person deems as excellence in business might differ from another person. Same with, health and personal well-being. There is going to be an element of subjectiveness to this. So whatever your own personal context is while you're listening to this, you can relate it back to that and think about what is excellence in my life and how does that look, and then how do the habits that I'm breaking and forming relate to what I'm trying to achieve. So to get started, let's actually define what a habit is so we're all on the same page as we're going through this. So throughout my research and my findings, there was a couple definitions that I really liked. The first one being, habits are behaviors that are wired so deeply in our brains that we perform them almost automatically. Another one is, a habit is an action that, once learned, becomes a pattern that does not require active decision making. So the reason I really like these two is because there's similarities between both of them, but they both kind of hit on the fact that an action, requires something to be learned. And then once it's learned, it's engraved in our minds, in our brains, which we'll talk about the science behind that in a minute. And then we perform them almost automatically or without requiring active decision making. In other words, these habits happen on a daily basis without us even really thinking about it. They just become part of what we do. They become part of who we are. And so I think those definitions really relate nicely back to the quote. So what did I mean about, the part where I said habits are wired so deeply in our brains? Well, there's actually a scientific reason for that. So if you think back to first, the thought of why habits were created from an evolutionary perspective, doing our daily routines and our daily things they require a lot of energy. Something as simple as getting up out of bed and going to the kitchen and then tying your shoes and, cooking an egg. These are all things that we now have as habits. They're routines. We know how to do them without really thinking. And so that conserves our energy. And it conserves our energy for, later in the day when we have to make difficult decisions, when we need to use our brains for, more difficult situations, more complex situations, these types of things. And from an evolutionary perspective, this would have been the same as, having habits or routines throughout your day that conserve your energy for when you need to have a life or death situation that requires your mental energy and your mental capacity. And so the science suggests that we can never actually make a habit disappear forever, but rather have the ability to replace it with something new or temporarily break it. But the brain never truly forgets the habit permanently. So let's look at the human brain. The human brain is like an onion. It's composed of layers and layers of cells. Most of our complex thinking, the things we really ponder over or trouble us, those happen in the outermost layers of the brain. Even you listening to this podcast right now is happening in the outermost layers of the brain. However, if you look at our brains from an evolutionary perspective, the outermost layer was added fairly recently. But as you go deep inside the brain, you'll find a golf ball sized lump of tissue called the basal ganglia. And this is where all your habits are essentially stored. So, for simplicity's sake, we can actually just view this as the habit center or the habit control room. This is where habits go to live, basically. And because there is such a prehistoric part of the brain, the basal ganglia, the same habit control center can be found in the brains of rats as well. So this brings us to the research study that I want to share with you. In order to study habit control, world-leading researchers from MIT conducted an experiment with rats. And I'm going to share that experiment with you. And this is going to do a really good job of depicting the part I said about how habits can never actually be forgotten. So, rats were dropped into a T-shaped maze, and within that maze, in the top left side of the maze, was hidden a piece of chocolate. So the rats would wander through the maze with no real, reason or sequence or pattern or anything like that. They would just be wandering through the maze, but they would be clearly sniffing for the chocolate. And eventually, all the rats found the chocolate. Some took longer initially, some took shorter, some took different routes, different patterns, but they all found the chocolate. When the researchers then scanned the rats' brains while they were looking for the chocolate, they saw that even though the rats looked very, relaxed and very calm as they were doing this and sniffing around, their brains were actually extremely active. So they were requiring a ton of mental capacity in order to find this chocolate. The rats then were removed, and when they were placed back into the maze, the rats immediately went directly to the chocolate. And their brain activity appeared to have completely disappeared. They were basically on autopilot. And so we see a habit or a routine was formed. So it's interesting because as I was listening to the study and this researcher, essentially what they're trying to show is that a habit is formed, and then once the habit is formed, it no longer requires that mental capacity that we're talking about. So the same as you getting up and going to the kitchen every morning, you now have that habit, so you do it in the morning without your brain actually having to work. You're on the same autopilot that the rat is when he gets dropped into the maze and goes straight to the chocolate. And so what happened was these rats formed a habit loop. And that's what we're going to focus on today. A lot of what we're going to talk about is this habit loop and the different parts of it. So a habit loop has 3 elements, and these elements are the same for humans as they are for rats. The first is your cue. And in this case, the cue for the rats was a clicking sound the moment that they were dropped into the maze. The second is a routine. In the case of the study, the routine was the rats going through the maze to the chocolate. And the third and final piece that is required is a reward. In this case, in the case of the study, it was the chocolate. So a cue, a routine, and a reward are all required for the forming of habits. So now that we know that, we can look at the next part of the research study. So researchers then went on, went one step further and removed the chocolate from the maze. And the rats still continued to go the exact same way through the maze, even without the reward at the end. So the routine remained the same, as did the cue, even though the reward was then removed. So as we can see from this is essentially the cue causes the neurological pathways in the brain to begin to fire up the habit control center. And from there, they then perform the routine. So, if we try to simplify as much as possible, the introduction of a cue caused the basal ganglia or the control center to get fired up, which is where our habits are stored. And then because that's fired up, we perform our habit, even though there is no longer a reward. So researchers then found a way to interfere with the rat's brain and shut off the automatic habit loop, which was causing the rats to go left. And the effect was that they were now able to get the rats to go right instead of left, using the same technique. In other words, a new habit was formed. However, when the researchers again interfered with the rat's brain, disabling the habit loop, turning off the right habit through the maze, so the rats were originally going left, turn that off, form new habit going right. They then turned it off again, and the rats instantaneously went back to the previous habit of going left. And they did so at the same speed and same accuracy as before. In other words, they didn't need to learn the old pathway again, and their brains showed again that they were on autopilot. So basically what we're seeing here is that the habit was never forgotten. What happened was it was replaced with something else, and as soon as the researchers were able to remove that new habit, the old habit immediately took back over as though it was never forgotten. And the researchers actually quoted saying the habit had never really been forgotten. So this leads to the common misconception that we can just get rid of habits when the science says otherwise. So what's the bad news? The bad news is we never really forget a habit, especially if it's a bad one. We'll never forget it. What's the good news? The good news is that a habit can be broken and they can be replaced. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So today we're going to focus on the 6 key elements to making and breaking habits. And I'm going to preface this by saying these are 6 things that are backed by science that I've found through listening to podcasts, through doing some research, through reading books, these sorts of things. And these are the kind of 6 that have really stuck out to me. It doesn't mean that these are the only 6. It doesn't even mean that they're the best 6. These are just the 6 that I felt either related to me the best, that I found to be the most impactful, and that I think will be useful to the audience who are listening to this, that they can try and implement in their lives in order to try and make or break their habits. So let's start with number 1. Number 1's relatively simple, but it's not always the easiest thing to do, and it is remove as many obstacles or distractions as you can. So in the case of trying to break a habit, for example, you want to make it as easy as possible for you to break whatever that habit is, meaning removing obstacles or things that are going to prevent you from doing that. So let's say you're trying to stop eating junk food. The first thing you need to do is you need to remove all the junk food from your home and from, anywhere else where you might be eating. So maybe it's removing it from the drawer in your office at work. Maybe it's removing it from your car, whatever it is. Remove the junk food from all the areas in which you normally eat. This is going to be huge because if the junk food's not readily available for you, it's going to be a lot less enticing for you to go and get it. And it's going to happen a lot less, let's call it routinely or subconsciously. You're not going to just be like, oh, I want a snack, open the drawer, there's a Snickers, you're going to eat it. So remove the junk food from your house. Make it easy to not have that junk food, if that makes sense. And additionally to that, you then want to make it easy to make the better decision or the new habit that you want to form. Meaning if you want to remove junk food and start eating healthier, go out and buy healthy snacks, buy healthy alternatives, buy fruit, buy things that are good for you, put those in your fridge, put those in your cupboard, portion them out. That way, it's as easy as possible for you to make that decision. This can be also not necessarily just removing things, but making it easy for you by removing the obstacle of having to make decisions, for example, when you wake up. So let's say you want to start going for runs in the morning. If you prep your clothes and your running shoes early in the morning and you put those right at the end of your bed, and you put your phone at the end of your bed as well, that way it's not right next to you, and your alarm goes off in the morning, it's going to be a lot easier for you to make that decision to go on the run because your shoes are prepped, your clothes are ready, you're already out of bed because you have to get out of bed to turn off your alarm. So it's making it easier for you. And the best part about that is there's a lot of different things you can do to make it easier. Sometimes you can take extreme measures, like maybe you sleep in your running clothes. For other people, it's maybe just putting your alarm in a different room. Whatever it is, give yourself the best chance to be successful by removing as many obstacles and distractions from your path. A little caveat to that as well, or additional piece to that one, is just understanding how the brain works. You see, the brain has a part of it called the prefrontal cortex. And this part of your brain is responsible for decision making and the formation of habits early on. So the beginning of a habit, the beginning part when you're trying to form it, it lives in your prefrontal cortex because that's part of the decision making. So when you wake up and you have to make the decision to go run, you're using the prefrontal cortex to make that decision. The habit is then, once it becomes habitual, so that means the habit itself is actually formed, it's then transferred to the basal ganglia, or the control center that we talked about earlier. This then means that the habit is fully formed and the prefrontal cortex now plays a significantly smaller role, if any, in the habit itself. So basically what we're saying from this is, in order to make a habit happen at the beginning, you need to have your prefrontal cortex as well equipped as possible to help you. Meaning things like stress, things like fatigue. These are all things that weaken or fatigue your prefrontal cortex. So if you're trying to start a habit, and let's say you want to start working out 30 minutes every day. If you make that decision early in the morning, it might be a bit easier because you're just waking up, your prefrontal cortex is well rested. It's a lot easier to make that decision. Whereas if you are waiting until after work to go work out, well, then you're now experiencing something called decision fatigue. And that is when you're making small decisions throughout the day, which add up, and it causes your prefrontal cortex to experience fatigue, that by the time you get to the end of the day, you're less likely to make the good decision and more likely to make a bad decision. I.e., if you have a fatigued prefrontal cortex, you're more likely to choose to not go to the gym and go home and have snack food than you are to make the tougher decision to go to the gym. So make your habits, or set yourself up in a way that if you're trying to form a new habit, maybe you're doing so at a time that provides you with the most well-rested prefrontal cortex in order to make that decision. We know that can't happen all the time, but you can absolutely form some habits in those times where you're most likely to be successful. So now we'll move on to number 2. And number 2's, I say a smaller one. I think all of these are important, but this is probably one that maybe we won't spend as much time on, but I think it is still vitally important, which is repetition and accountability. So there's 2 things to really note here. First off, all habits require repetition. Now, some require more, some require less. And that is also based on the person or the individual. So we've all listened to, popular literature or people saying that, it takes 21 days to form a habit, it takes 60 days to form a habit, it takes 2 weeks, whatever. The reality is the science shows that the amount of time it takes to form a habit is different from person to person. There's no one set time. And that's just because every human's brain, every human's prefrontal cortex and their control center and just the makeup of every human being is different. And so the science clearly shows that the only consistency about it is the requirement for repetition, that something must happen over and over again in order for it to become a habit. How long it takes is totally dependent on you as a person. You could be the person that takes 2 weeks. You could be the person that takes 200 days. So knowing yourself is going to be a big part of that, and knowing how long you need to repeat this routine in order for it to become a sustainable habit. The second piece on that is accountability. And this is one that I think is just more of a little kind of hack or cheat code for anybody who's trying to create a habit. when you have accountability, ideally somebody who's helping keep you accountable, this can just act as a form of motivation, right? You're going to have the support and encouragement from that individual who's going to encourage you to keep going, especially when when you're tired or fatigued and you don't want to, or when you're not feeling up to it, or when you really want to cheat. Having somebody that you can turn to, who can motivate you, who encourage you and support you, is huge. Also, knowing that you have to report to someone, it can also kind of give you this sense of obligation, like, oh, I need to get this done because I know I'm going to have to tell this person if I don't. And that kind of lines up with the third element of this, which is cognitive dissonance. So for anybody who doesn't know what cognitive dissonance is, it's essentially when our ideal self does not align with our actual self. So our ideal self is the person we want to be, the person that we aim to be. Our actual self is the person that we currently are based off of our actions and what we do on a daily basis. And when you have this disalignment between the two, you experience cognitive dissonance. And this can provide a really, negative mental feeling and even a physical feeling. And so sometimes in order to avoid that feeling, we might actually use that as motivation to say, okay, I'm going to align my actions and my actual self with my ideal self in order to create this alignment of our values and our beliefs and essentially get rid of that negative feeling from the cognitive dissonance. So I think there's, this little kind of, trick or hack, like I said, within that accountability piece that can just provide that little extra motivation, especially on the days when you need it, because chances are if you're forming a habit or breaking a habit that is worth changing, it's going to require a little extra help sometimes. The third one is know your cues. And so this one's really interesting because if you think about it, throughout our lives and in our day-to-day life, you could have hundreds, maybe thousands of cues that spark different habits. And so when you can know the cues that are sparking your negative habits that you want to get rid of, it gives you a really good chance of being successful in breaking those habits. So the science actually shows that a smoker who removes a cue, such as an ashtray, is significantly more likely to give up smoking. So basically, just knowing the cues, it gives you the opportunity to maybe dispose of it or change it, and that can set you up for success. If you don't know what your cues are, it's going to be really hard to then say, oh, how am I supposed to break this habit? But if you know, hey, every time I have a glass of wine, I also want to have a piece of chocolate, well, then maybe you can say, okay, if I really want to stop eating junk food, I need to stop having that glass of wine. And then comes the piece of, replacing that habit. So now when 7 o'clock rolls around and you want to have the glass of wine, but the glass of wine is the cue for the chocolate, instead, you just keep your fridge well stocked. Going back to our first one of making sure it's easy, keep your fridge well stocked with something else that you enjoy drinking. Maybe it's a bubbly or a carbonated drink or water or whatever it is. And you have that instead. And now you've removed the cue and you've replaced it with a different cue, which hopefully results in a different routine. Number 4, I think this one is pretty big, is focus on replacing bad habits, not stopping them. So the key word there is you want to focus on replacing the habit, not stopping the habit. You see, when we're human beings by nature, we're humans of action. We like to do things. We don't like to stop doing things. So if you know anybody, for example, who took on a really serious diet, let's say, and where they stopped eating all these things, they stopped drinking all these things, more often than not, people revert back to their original ways eventually, because the act of stopping something without replacing it is not sustainable. It's really, really difficult. And for a majority of people, it often leads to some form of regression and going back to your old ways. Instead, focus on replacing the bad habit. So instead of saying, oh, I want to stop eating candy, replace it with, I want to start eating healthier food. So now your focus is on making sure your fridge is stocked with fruits and with veggies and with healthy snacks. And so now you're not focused on quitting candy. you're focused on eating healthier. And that little flip, that little transition from quitting to starting and replacing, I think can make a huge, huge difference for most people. The fifth key, and this one between 5 and 6, I think are two of the biggest ones. You need a better reason to quit. So basically, if we look at what habits are, if we know that they never fully disappear, they're never forgotten, then we have to know that if you don't have a bigger reason to quit, the habit with the reward that is better will eventually win out. For example, someone who wants to quit smoking and then replaces that habit with chewing gum. The dopamine they get from the nicotine in the cigarette is surely going to outweigh the gum. However, if you have an intrinsic motivation to quit smoking, you are significantly more likely to succeed. So this is that bigger reason why. It stems from your intrinsic motivation. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, essentially intrinsic motivation is your reason for doing something that it's genuinely and personally important to you. It goes beyond just an external reward or some form of payment, but it actually aligns with your core values and beliefs. So intrinsic, coming from within, this is the motivation you need if you want to be successful when you're trying to quit or stop really difficult habits. So I'll just share an example in my life where I saw the power of the intrinsic motivation versus, the extrinsic or the reward, that sort of thing. For a long time, I wanted to, and for me, it's always been a struggle, is junk food. And I wanted to stop eating junk food. And so at the beginning, I kind of knew why, kind of didn't. I was just like, oh yeah, I want to stop eating sugars because I know it's healthy for me, and I want to be healthier. I don't want to be addicted to candy. I don't want to feel like I need it. And so I basically had this kind of, we'll call it not shallow, but less intrinsically motivated reason to stop eating sugars. And so what happened is initially I did all the steps, right? I stopped eating sugars. I removed the sugars from my house and where I lived in order to make it easier for me to stop. I would buy healthy foods and healthy alternatives, and I would keep those readily available, and I would portion out my fruit, and I did all these things. And for a while, it worked. But there was two things I found. The first was that I made it so that I wasn't eating sugars on Monday through Friday, but then Saturday, Sunday, I found myself just going absolute bananas on desserts and sugars and pop because I wasn't actually fully removing the habit or breaking it. I was just more delaying the habit of eating sugars. The second thing I found was it wasn't sustainable. It was a really difficult thing for me to do, and when the times got really tough, I found myself cheating a bit. I found myself having a piece of chocolate here, a piece of chocolate there, that sort of thing. So instead, I decided I needed a bigger reason why. I had to say, reflect and say, okay, why do I really want to stop eating chocolate? And then I started to dig and did a little bit of self-reflection, and I realized, well, stopping eating candies and sweets and chocolate was actually a secondary habit that I wanted to form. The first one was the habit of taking a cold plunge every morning. That was my initial habit. That was the one I wanted to form. So instead of sleeping in, which was what I was doing prior to that, I wanted to break the habit of sleeping in, and I wanted to form the habit of waking up and doing a cold plunge. So I started to think, well, why did I choose that in the first place? And it was because I learned through research and podcasts and all these things that cold plunging had all these great mental health benefits for you and these physical health benefits. And I realized that the reason I was doing a lot of this stuff was because I wanted to live a long and healthy life. I wanted to get to an older age in life, and when I got there, I didn't want to be, weak or frail. I wanted to be an older person who one day can still go and play with their kids or grandkids at the park, and who can still be active. And, you see those 95-year-olds who are still walking up and down the street every day and, working in their gardens. That's what I wanted. I want to be a healthy older individual one day. And so I knew the best way for me to give myself a chance to do that is to live a healthier life. And that was cold plunging. So when I realized that the cold plunge was actually the, I guess, spark for me wanting to also stop eating treats and candies, I then had this intrinsic motivation to say, oh, I'm trying to do this not because I just want to stop feeling addicted to candy or stop feeling the need for it, but I actually want to do this because later in life, I want to see the benefits of this, and hopefully they happen. And so that was my intrinsic motivation for doing all this in the first place. And that, had a domino effect to all these other really great things that I do now, which is exercise and which is research and this podcast even. And it was all a domino effect from one good habit that was formed and then layered upon layered upon layer. But the intrinsic motivation for the original habit itself was something that was meaningful to me. It wasn't for somebody else. It wasn't a reward. It wasn't recognition. It was me wanting to be healthier so I could live a long and healthy life. And so I know that was a little bit of a long-winded explanation or reason for it, but I think it just shows like there is a absolute truth to having intrinsic motivation and how that is more powerful than some of the extrinsic motivation that you might find elsewhere. And so my sixth and final key, and this is one of my favorites, I've decided to title it, Make the Change Before the Change Makes You. So say it one more time. Make the change before the change makes you. Basically, what that means is there comes a point in a lot of people's lives where they're forced to make a change. And often it's unfortunate that change is due to unfortunate circumstances. Maybe it's a health scare. Maybe it's, the death of a loved one. Maybe it's the loss of a job. Maybe it's the failure of a company. Maybe it's getting cut from a sports team. Whatever it is, we often have this moment where we're forced to make a change. And instead, I want to encourage people to make the change before the change makes you. And so there's a really great quote, and it goes, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of making the change. And I think that just goes hand in hand with what I'm saying here, in that if you can identify that a change will benefit you and you can make that change earlier on, that's going to be a whole lot easier and a whole lot better for you than waiting until an extreme circumstance. So let's use the example of an athlete. Maybe we'll keep it a little bit more lighthearted than some of the health stuff, but an athlete. You can either recognize the bad habits you have as an athlete, i.e. maybe you go to bed really late, maybe you don't eat properly, maybe you train poorly, whatever these things are. And you can replace those habits with good habits early on, meaning, okay, I'm going to replace going to bed late with going to bed early and waking up at a good time. I'm going to replace the habit of training poorly with, training effectively every single day for 30 minutes or an hour. I'm going to replace the habit of eating poorly with, eating 3 meals a day. And you're going to use the process we've talked about today of, establishing a cue, establishing a routine, and establishing a reward in order to start implementing those habits. And you're going to do all of this before you have a distinct reason to do it. Otherwise, what happens is you wait until you get cut from a team, or you lose your position, or you lose a scholarship, or whatever it is, and now you're in this place of desperation where it's like, now I have to make a change. Now I have to do something different. And so although this key isn't necessarily part of the habit making itself, I think it's a key element to it because it's part of the recognition. It's essentially recognizing you need to change your habits if you want to be able to control them before you're forced to change a habit. Because being in a position where you're forced to change a habit is not a great place to be, especially because sometimes in the case of, let's say it's a health scare or the death of a loved one or whatever it is, you can't go backwards sometimes. Sometimes there's no fixing what's already been done. So now you're changing habits just to cope or to, stretch out as much time as possible, or these types of things. And so I think that idea of making the change before the change makes you is a really powerful one. And I think it can tie really nicely with, finding that intrinsic motivation and that that bigger reason why, I think those work hand in hand really nicely. So those are my 6 keys to making and breaking habits. Again, there's so much to it. Obviously, we've identified that those 3 key elements of, a cue, a routine, and a reward. We've identified that a reward is necessary to form a habit, but then can be removed. So for all of you out there who are thinking, okay, well, what if my reward is contradictory, i.e., what if my reward to going for a run every morning is coming back home and getting to have a sweet treat for breakfast? Maybe you need that at the start, but eventually you'll be able to remove the reward and the habit will remain the same. So keep that in mind as you're doing it. And there was actually, while I was doing my research, there was a little bit of a bonus thing that I wanted to include that I thought was just kind of interesting. And it's this idea that willpower is not enough. And so this one is really cool, I think, because a lot of time we think of willpower as like a skill, but it's actually not a skill. It's more of a muscle that can be built and used, but it also gets fatigued. So your willpower is what helps you make the tougher decisions. You have the willpower to make the tough decisions. But as your willpower gets fatigued, it makes it less likely for you to actually make those good decisions. There was an experiment done, and it was called the cookie experiment. And to basically run through it really quickly is there's 2 groups of people. One group was was shown a plate of cookies and a plate of radishes, and they were asked to eat the cookies. Don't resist the urge, go for it. The others were asked to use their willpower and resist the urge to eat the cookies and instead eat the radishes. After 5 minutes, basically they removed the cookies and the radishes, and the researchers gave the individuals a puzzle to solve. However, the puzzle was impossible to solve. There was no solve to it. And what they found was the people who ate the cookies, so who didn't need to use any of their willpower up until that point, they were much more relaxed while trying to solve the puzzle. And on average, they worked 19 minutes before quitting. So they were on average working 19 minutes to solve this impossible puzzle before they said, okay, I give up. However, the radish eaters were the opposite. As they were doing it, they were not relaxed. They were angry, a lot vented. Some even snapped at the researchers, and they quit after 8 minutes on average. So less than half the time spent on task. And so what this goes to show you is that the willpower is a muscle. It can be fatigued, and the more it gets fatigued, the less likely you are to make the tough decisions. And so there's actually even researchers that went even one step further and said, okay, we're going to remove the element of something like sugar, which does provide dopamine and that sort of thing, because obviously that could be a question saying, okay, well, the people who ate the sugar, maybe they had a little bit of dopamine, maybe they were feeling better. And they conducted other studies. So studies that didn't involve sugar but had the exact same results. For example, they were a study done with individuals that were shown a very emotional film. And one half of the group was asked not to let their emotions come out, i.e. not cry or whatever. And the other half was asked to let their emotions flow. And then after doing that, they were put into a physical test, for example, running on a treadmill. And the ones who let their emotions out were performing better on the physical test, running longer and going harder than the ones who didn't. So it's just showing that there is this element of willpower, and it's actually called the willpower depletion theory, and you can look it up. But this idea that willpower is the thing that does deplete throughout the day and over time as you're making tough decisions. So how does this correlate back to the whole habits thing? Well, you have to recognize that there are going to be times when your willpower is going to deplete. So having a strong willpower is not enough to break a habit or to form a habit. You have to set yourself up properly using all these other different tricks, because if you just say, yeah, you know what, I have a lot of willpower, I'm just going to stop smoking, or I'm just going to stop drinking alcohol. Yeah, that's great. But if you've had a stressful day at work and you've had to make a bunch of decisions and you had to, not bite that person's head off who made you really upset, and then you had to, not get to eat lunch because you had to make the decision to do a couple extra things at work or a project that was due. And you get home at that point, that combination of decision-making fatigue, the willpower depletion, all these things come into play. And that's when you're most susceptible to reverting back to your old habits and your old ways. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that little bonus one in there. I think basically what I've learned from all this is that it's fascinating. You understand why habits and goals are so, intertwined, and why it's so important to have good, healthy habits in your life, and why it's so difficult to break bad habits once they're formed, because unless you really understand the science behind it and the process, it can be really difficult. And I also think this shows why when you are trying to break habits and when you are trying to achieve goals, you need to do it step by step. You need to do it in a way that's attainable, sustainable. Don't set 50 different goals for yourself and then try and achieve them all, or even 10. Set 1 or 2 and achieve those goals. Try and break one habit and then break 2 and then break 3. Build up to it and do it step by step. This is going to significantly increase your likelihood of having success in breaking a habit or achieving a goal versus trying to lay out a bunch of them and then trying to do it all at once. And then that last piece, again, just being finding a reward is key. Finding a reward to go with these new routines to help form the habit is so crucial. It has to be meaningful. It has to be something that is really, truly giving you that reward feeling. And then eventually, like I said, you can remove it. But finding a reward to start off is going to be a key piece to that. So yeah, that wraps up this solo episode of, making and breaking habits. Just scrolling here through my show notes, I know there's so much I missed. There's so many different things we can talk about here. We can deep dive even further into cues and routines and rewards, and we can talk about what are some really good rewards that you could have, all these different things. So, if you've experienced this in your own life and you have some great tips, I would love to hear about it. If you think I've missed anything important, I'd love to hear from you as well. I think that there's a lot more to go on this topic, and maybe it's something we will revisit at some point. But I hope this was a good foundation for you. I hope there's something in here that might help you to, achieve your goals in breaking habits, forming habits, and ultimately in unlocking your potential. So that's it for today. We'll see you guys next time. Thanks for stopping in.